Eagle 6 in the 10.
Roger.
Viper 1 bombs away. One's going to climb high above 20 east to south.
Eagle 6 radar contact. Eagle 6 is visual.
Planet goes left.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. This is Brickley Hedgehog, and today something a little bit different. We're going to talk about why we don't have perhaps a dynamic campaign in DCS world yet. And I think it's a multifaceted issue, but this particular video was sparked by an interview that you may have seen recently on the Enigma YouTube channel with the creator of the dynamic campaign for Falcon 4. His name is Kevin Klemick. That campaign, which was produced around 26 years ago, still remains as the gold standard for dynamic campaign designers for combat flight simulation. The trouble is, no one's really done a better campaign since. That is, one that delivers the layers of AI simulation encompassing supply and production, as well as air-to-air and other forms of combat in a sprawling, persistent environment. As the interview wound on, it became fairly clear to me why perhaps we don't yet have a fully dynamic campaign in DCS world, in conjunction with comments that ED has already revealed publicly. And as Klemick stated in the interview, it's extremely difficult to do and possibly not even economically viable. Nonetheless, ED is still working on one, so let's discuss why perhaps we don't yet have a dynamic campaign in DCS world despite community demands for it. Well, let's begin with some info about what we mean here and definitions for a dynamic campaign, as this is a little bit of a topic in itself. So in addition to the Enigma interview, I also noted an interesting video series from T-Buck on YouTube who analyzed this very thing and ED's game structure and how it differs from Falcon BMS and Falcon 4, the original version. We do have campaigns in the game already, as well as some really good user content that mimics aspects of a dynamic campaign. However, these don't quite fit our true definition for a dynamic campaign, even if they're done really well. So what we're talking about here again is something that includes ground warfare, air warfare, naval warfare, the means of production, distribution of resources, some sort of replacement structure for reserves and supplies, and supply lines, among other things. So all this is intricately linked, and depending on the map structure may even be influenced by resources traded between allied countries. Objects that are destroyed will generally remain destroyed, and the AI will have to decide whether or not it is practical and efficient and has enough resources to rebuild, say, something like a destroyed airfield, or whether or not it is too costly or penalizes them too greatly to use resources to do that. So it has to consolidate, if you like, based on what you, the player, are doing and what the opposing force is doing. So it's a very sophisticated set of algorithms that are all, as I said, intricately linked. Now, T-Buck cited a couple of games that have come close to doing this in conjunction with Falcon 4. He mentioned Tornado, which is a game I'm not familiar with, but he also talked about EF 2000, which I had played many years ago, and I still remember actually picking out the box and being really intrigued as to what was being offered here. It was one of the few times I've seen what was argued at the time a truly realistic simulation on a dynamic campaign with an aircraft that at that time was state-of-the-art. That was the Eurofighter. And it offered a whole new chapter for me in combat flight sim gaming, similar to some years later when I picked up the first GTR Simbin racing game, and having a whole new chapter in sim racing opened up to me as well. Both games were some of the most realistic in their time. Seems hard to believe now. In fact, some people do still play GTR 2 and rate its AI as some of the best ever created in sim racing. So there's some challenges out there in terms of the early work that was done in some simulation games. But the bottom line is that no one has produced a campaign for a flight sim really that rivals the effort put into Falcon 4 just yet, and it remains, as I said, the benchmark for a truly dynamic campaign in a flight simulation environment. Now, if ED does create something that rivals, or certainly their intent is to exceed it, they will have pulled off a combat flight simulation coup and filled a gap in the marketplace that's been untapped for almost 3 decades now. Klemick advised that he was an intern all those years ago in the late 90s working with an open checkbook to essentially build a persistent AI engine that would avoid the necessity of the Falcon 4 developers creating a series of scripted missions. The flaw in the scripted mission model is that it has inherent limitations of replayability and a lack of realism. It's not a persistent world, enemies appear in the same place, and the mission is the same every time. His task initially was to create something which generated randomized missions in order to free the game developers from set-piece action, such as what we see with some of the mission sets in DCS World, and certainly the instant action missions as examples. That work that Klimek was doing then morphed into a fully dynamic campaign, and as he said at the time, he never really considered it couldn't be done. He just devoted a ridiculous number of hours per week doing it, something like 80 hours per week over years. And he said it may not even be feasible to do it today from a cost point of view, but the amount of time needed to complete that kind of campaign for relatively low payoff. He indicated that if he had his time again, he would probably work on some sort of MMO and focus on the inclusion of VR technology, which he felt was perfect for flight simulation today. One of the features of the Falcon 4 dynamic campaign success is scalability. So it uses aggregation algorithms which allow the player to only interact with full fidelity models within a given bubble. So Falcon 4 was very good at bouncing back and forth with the bubble of fidelity as the player moves through the environment. Now why this is critical is that it means that the game can tabulate some activities where the player is not present on the map or objects are outside of that high fidelity bubble. And he made this reference to tabletop games where you are simplifying some forms of combat so you don't have to have the full fidelity modules modeled everywhere all over the map persistently. This reduces the logic crunching required to run the game wherever potentially hundreds, if not thousands of objects are present within that theater of operations that the player's bubble is situated. Now in small maps, he said you could in theory run significant numbers of objects in full fidelity with current gaming hardware and save the hassle of having to develop an aggregation system and the scaling system. But the larger the map and the more units that you have, it's simply not feasible to do that with the level of modern fidelity we see in games like DCS World. And we're not just talking about the high polygon count exterior modeling, say on the F-14, we're also talking about the sensors, the radar, the flight model, and all of those kinds of things that are a parcel of and a feature of these high fidelity modules and use a lot of number crunching to run in the game. So in simple terms, DCS and apparently IL-2 cannot operate this kind of scalable system, and we see aspects of this when we see a large number of objects which are present on some maps. This includes things like ballistic objects as well, which are all being calculated at the same time. So if you have a high number of cruise missiles and other high fidelity modules all packed in a small space, it can cause the game to slow down. And this was brought up in a recent discussion that Wags talked about. Now, it essentially requires a lot of number crunching, as I said, and can saturate some CPUs. And I suspect because of the linear processing in DirectX 11, this causes some of our CPUs to kind of slow down. And as I said, Wags has already indicated this is an aspect of the game set for attention, but requires Vulkan implementation to tackle it as a workaround, because Vulkan allows the game designers to use less linear processing and use more simultaneous processing powers to unlock that the modern hardware that we have is able to use. Now, I suspect that aside from the complexity of building the dynamic campaign into the video game engine, there are some performance issues to iron out as well. While the 26-year-old programming built into Falcon 4 and BMS is very impressive, ED's Nick Gray has made it clear that the team is not interested in producing another Falcon 4 style campaign, which makes absolute sense to me why they would go with that intent, because we know that the comparison is going to be made even if ED produces a product that bears no resemblance to Falcon 4 and is set in even a different theater of operations. There's still going to be people that are going to use that gold standard as a benchmark or as a launch point to analyze what ED has done. It's going to need to be different, visually different in the interface, and encompass the numerous aircraft that we have in DCS, the list of which continues to grow, and Falcon 4 didn't have that problem. They also didn't have errors to tackle as well, and ED have not yet mentioned if there's any scope for a World War II DC or dynamic campaign as things stand, as far as I can see. What we do know is that the work has been in place since 2018 by a dedicated team of talented people, with more recent development in AI logic helping significantly, according to Nick Gray. So let's look at a statement from way back in 2020 when ED said the following thing about their dynamic campaign implementation work. The DCS World Dynamic Campaign Engine combines a real-time strategy or RTS engine with military forces and economic layers, production, logistics, use and transfer of resources, that pitch two opposing sides aided by advanced strategic and tactical AI. So that's the backdrop of what they're trying to create. We now have completed the core RTS logic and have connected it to DCS World. They are currently finalizing the basics of the in-game economic models. We'll be working on the combat tasking logic and certain win-win situations in the near future. The last stage will be the client-server architecture needed to support large campaigns with ongoing online sessions. So this, I guess, is reference to the MMO content and focus that Klimek said he would do today if he had the option. Edie went on to say back then that they are certain that you're going to have many detailed questions and look forward to revealing more information on this module as and when we are in a position to demonstrate some of the features live. Now, as far as I know, I don't think we've seen any live features for the dynamic campaign. Now, that was approximately 4 years ago, so what happened? Well, remember we had this thing called COVID, which caused a huge snarl up in the evolution of development in many areas of our life, and obviously it had an impact on Eagle Dynamics and the DCS World Engine. And since then, though, we've also had significant updates to DCS core engine, including things like the multi-threading and the work being done on Vulkan, to name just a few. So, scrolling ahead about 3 years, as of late last year, ED gave us a lot more detail, which actually makes a lot more sense to me now that I've looked at what Klimek was talking about and also what T-Buck was referring to, as well as some other sources that I've been looking at with regards to dynamic campaign stuff. So they went on to say that the DCS DC, or the DCS Dynamic Campaign, it's now got an official term if you like, is one of the most important tasks for the future of DCS, as it will add a much new and much demanded evolution and improvement of gameplay for both single player and multiplayer. So again, we have this reference to potential MMO type situations. Rather than mimic past solutions, so here's that reference again that we're not going to redo Falcon 4 or BMS. We hope to set a new standard, good, one that provides a high level of interaction and authenticity, immersion, and ease of use. So a couple of very interesting things there going on, and I think the ease of use again is going to be the GUI interface that they have in terms of creating set parameters for the campaign that the user can control. So the goal here is to deliver, they say, a system that allows players to create, as I said, their own dynamic or non-scripted campaigns that will evolve based on strategic and tactical AI decisions, indirect player influences on AI actions, and direct player influences on the battlefield. So very dynamic, very interactive, and as I said, a persistent kind of world there. This will all leverage existing DCS features such as voice chat, new ATC mechanisms, etc. This has been a tall order. In other words, yeah, this has been very difficult to do, and the effort that has been underway since 2018 with a small but dedicated team. So again, approximately 6 years or so for those who are paying attention to the basic math here. Now, our focus in 2022 was on the creation and testing of general air operation tasks, they said, and in 2023 we shifted their efforts to ground operations, and this area will break new ground for dynamic campaigns and includes the following tasks. The creation of a realistic road network system that is based on a new road editor system. This allows units to have appropriate road movement conditions that are tied to the logistics and supply network. This also integrates into the movement of ground unit formations, and they get quite down into the nitty-gritty of how these things work. So a new ground unit formations editor was created that allows the accurate assembly of units based levels of command from platoon up to division, with all command levels in between. Command structures vary based on the country and era, just like the real world, and with correct terminology. Unit formations then operate realistically within their larger force structure based on tasking such as road march, meeting engagement, assault, defense, retreat, route, etc. They addressed ground forces behavior once engaged. This was one of the biggest and most complex tasks. Much of this was dependent upon force tasking, support from neighboring forces, organization of frontline forces, logistics, munition and fuel levels, and disposition of enemy forces. To assist with these items, a new and improved pathfinding mechanism was developed that considers both the terrain topography and restrictive zones within it. This allows more sensible routing of formations based on the terrain properties. In other words, vehicles aren't just going to drive over the top of a hill, they're probably going to go through a valley or use the terrain in a more logical fashion. In addition to ground operation tasks, they continue to work on air operations related tasks, For instance, many airfields currently have too few parking spaces available for a large dynamic campaign. They don't want to be limited to such numbers for large scenarios. To address this, they have developed a new process and expanded spawn points for aircraft. Next, they will finalize ground tasking, increase the level of internal and external testing, and begin work on the important graphic user interface. So since that update, I believe some changes have been implemented, I think in the mission editor software to fix some spawn points and other quality of life issues within the mission editor. But as you can tell from that detailed description, there's a heck of a lot of programming going on in the background to make this a viable entity in DCS World. So again, I think my original statement stands. If they pull this off, it will be a major coup for the team and add the replayability that solo players and even multiplayer groups are looking for to satiate a persistent environment in which to interact with. Now, Nineline has indicated that we could see an update on the dynamic campaign soon, which I'm hopeful for, so stay tuned on that. So I suspect, based on that, the discussion that we've had on scalability and the algorithm structure, this has been one heck of a project that I think it's good to hear from Clemic, because a lot of people have said on my channel in the past, well, you know, Falcon 4 did this 20 years ago and they didn't seem to have an issue creating it. Why hasn't DCS and Eagle Dynamics done this? And I think you can see from this just how complex it is to do such a thing. And from the horse's mouth too, Clemic said it was extremely difficult to do. He said perhaps if he had had his time again, he probably wouldn't have done it, or at least, you know, in hindsight would have done things perhaps in a different way. And he admitted it's never perfect. It's impossible to produce a perfect video game. There's always things that are compromised on because of finances, timelines, and just feasibility. And things get missed, and you know, bugs creep in, that kind of stuff. There's always work to be done on a video game once it's released. So I'm hoping that we do see some sort of update, and I'm very, very curious to see how much longer it's going to take ED to get this product into the game, and what are the other stumbling blocks, or what are the things that they need to still produce to get it to work. I'm very interested in what both Clemic sort of said, but also what T-Buck said about the scalability, the algorithms. And Nick Gray had said in an interview late last year about the fact that AI logic has made a big difference in their ability to make progress on the game, and they're still working on it. He said definitely that it's something of a product that they've bitten off more than they can chew, perhaps, but that remains to be seen. Like I said, if they do produce it, it will be definitely a dynamic campaign coup, because we really haven't had anything similar to Falcon 4 for, like I said, well over 2 decades, almost 3 decades, since that work began on that amazing feature, and the campaign actually became the game, as they said. So I think it's critical that ED do this. I think it's got to come. They will add that playability that people are looking for, and will solve some of the limitations, if you like, that ED has when it introduces new modules into the game, so that sometimes new modules get very little support. There's maybe some training missions, maybe a couple of scenarios, maybe some instant action stuff, and then once you've completed those or played around with those, you're left really hoping for other people to create missions for you, or you're building them yourself, or if you're lucky, one of the third-party developers produces a campaign that's vivid and exciting enough to want you to play it and replay it several times. And there are some out there that are very, very good. There are others that perhaps aren't so good. I think this, if they can pull it off, will be a major event for DCS World and could be a game changer for the current structure that we have. The short answer is, let's hope that Nineline is right and we get an update on that campaign progress. We'll see. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening and supporting the channel with those likes, subscribes, and comments in the comment section below. We'll see you next time on the DCS Sit Rep. I'm your host, Prickly Hedgehog. Again, thank you for tuning in. Cheers.